Hey APUSH students, are you preparing for your APUSH exam? Well, here's the whole course in just 30 minutes. Period 1 begins in 1491 with the study of Native American cultures before European contact. Now, natives developed unique cultures based on climate and geography. In Central and South America, the Aztecs and the Mayas relied on maize cultivation. These tribes were large and complex, with intricate trade networks, sophisticated calendars, and irrigation systems. In North America, tribes were mostly small and semi-nomadic. Indigenous peoples on the Great Plains hunted buffalo and lived in teepees, while those near the Great Lakes lived in more permanent dwellings like longhouses and developed agriculture. But everything changed in 1492 when Christopher Columbus arrived in the Americas. This leads us to one of the most important concepts for period 1, which is the Columbian Exchange. This refers to the exchange of plants, animals, ideas, peoples, and diseases between the Old World and the New World. European nations gained wealth from exploiting these new resources and experienced a population boom because of new food sources. And while natives gained horses, which aided in hunting, their populations were devastated by new diseases like smallpox. Spanish colonization also led to the rise of conquistadors who were seeking gold, God, and glory. College Board's favorite example is Hernan Cortez, who brutally conquered the Aztecs. Conquistadors also set up the encomienda system to enslave native populations and force them to convert to Catholicism. This also led to the establishment of the casta system, which was a racial hierarchy with Spaniards at the top, mestizos and mulattoes in the middle, and natives and enslaved Africans at the bottom. But many questioned the harsh treatments of natives, which led to the Valladolid debates. At these debates, Catholic priest Bartolomé de las Casas supported converting the natives, but opposed the brutality of the encomienda system. But Juan Gines de Sepulveda argued that the natives were barbaric and that the Spanish had the right to enslave them. Ultimately, these debates led to the decline of the encomienda system, but it was replaced with the asiento system, which enslaved Africans. Now, period 2 focuses on colonization from 1607 to 1754. The French established small settlements like Quebec and New Orleans along the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. They maintained friendly relations with natives, which helped them profit from fur trading. And the French also focused on Catholic conversion, but through peaceful Jesuit missionaries. And the Dutch were similar to the French, establishing the New Amsterdam colony for trade. But English colonization was characterized by mass migration, beginning with Jamestown in 1607. Now, Jamestown was founded by a joint stock company to make profit for its investors and for the British Crown. Tobacco plantations became the basis of the economy and the social structure of the Chesapeake colonies, which included Virginia and Maryland. But while settlers in Virginia were mostly profit-motivated, Maryland was founded as a refuge for Catholics. Like the Chesapeake region, the southern colonies of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia also grew cash crops, but focused more on rice, indigo, and sugar. And South Carolina had the heaviest concentration of African enslaved laborers of all of the colonies, which led to violent uprisings like the Stono Rebellion and the passage of strict slave codes. Now, the New England colonies like Massachusetts were established for religious reasons. This was demonstrated by Puritan leader John Winthrop's City Upon a Hill sermon. These strict religious societies were made up of close-knit towns centered around the church. And the New England colonies had rocky soil that was not suitable for plantation agriculture. Because of this, their economies depended on fishing, lumbering, and trade through port cities like Boston. But they banished dissenters like Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams, who went on to found Rhode Island. And the middle colonies were the most ethnically and economically diverse. In 1664, England took over Dutch New Amsterdam and renamed it New York. And William Penn founded the Pennsylvania colony on Quaker ideals like freedom and equality. They had friendlier relationships with Native Americans and generally opposed slavery. These colonies were also called the breadbasket because they capitalized off of grain farming. They also profited from shipping and lumbering. Because of rapid population growth, tensions mounted between colonists and indigenous tribes over land and resources. This led to violent conflicts like the Powhatan Uprising or King Philip's War, which often had devastating consequences for natives. Over time, the 13 colonies developed a distinct culture. This was partially because of the geographic distance and the unique landscape, but also because of a unique tradition of self-government. This was seen through the Mayflower Compact, the Virginia House of Burgesses, and the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. The colonies' economies were based on the theory of mercantilism, where a country grows wealthy by exporting more than it has to import. In an attempt to control colonial trade, the Crown passed a series of navigation acts, but they were loosely enforced under a policy known as salutary neglect. And in the 1730s, a religious revival known as the First Great Awakening occurred, led by Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Edwards brought people into the church using fear with sermons like Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, while Whitefield inspired emotional conversions at massive camp meetings. So the colonists began to question church authority, which also led them to question the authority of the British Crown. And in example of colonists questioning British authority was Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon led a violent revolt of poor farmers in 1676 against Virginia's royal governor William Berkeley over unfair treatment and a lack of protection from attacks by Native Americans. This showed the growing tensions between settlers and colonial leaders. This rebellion also contributed to the transition from indentured servitude to the use of enslaved African labor in the Virginia colony. Now, period 3 starts in 1754 with the French and Indian War. This was part of a larger conflict, but unfolded in America because of British expansion into the Ohio River Valley, which was controlled by French traders and indigenous tribes. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, drastically altering the relationship between the colonists and the British Crown. And in the same year, Pontiac's Rebellion took place, which led to the passage of the Proclamation of 1763. This banned settlement past the Appalachian Mountains to prevent further native conflicts. After the war, Britain was also left with a large amount of debt. This caused them to end the policy of salutary neglect, which angered the colonists. Tensions mounted in the colonies over new taxes like the Stamp Act in 1765. Groups like the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty protested and famously cried no taxation without representation. And while the 1770 Boston Massacre angered the colonists, the 1773 Boston Tea Party angered the Crown, leading to the passage of the Intolerable Acts. Despite attempts to maintain peace at the First Continental Congress, shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, leading to the Second Continental Congress. And after Thomas Paine's common sense convinced colonists that independence was the best route, the Declaration of Independence was drafted on July 4th, 1776. Both documents were inspired by Enlightenment ideals like republicanism and natural rights. Despite being the underdogs, the Continental Army won the American Revolution because of George Washington's leadership, the use of guerrilla warfare tactics, and support of allies like the French. And the war ended in 1783 with another Treaty of Paris and granted America its independence. But the new nation had all sorts of problems, mostly because leaders created an intentionally weak government called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles lacked the power to tax or create a national currency. And there was only a legislative branch which allowed 1 vote per state. With 9 votes needed to pass a law and 13 to amend the Articles, the federal government had little power. This was demonstrated when they failed to put down Shays' Rebellion. Now, this led to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, where delegates proposed a series of compromises for the new government. The Great Compromise established a bicameral legislature, and the controversial 3/5 Compromise appeased Southerners by partially counting enslaved people towards representation. The Constitution also included ideas like separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism. But Federalists and Anti-Federalists debated ratification of the new Constitution. Anti-Federalists feared the new government was too strong and pushed for a Bill of Rights. But Federalists, who were led by Alexander Hamilton, published the Federalist Papers to argue for the new, stronger government. Ultimately, the Constitution was ratified in 1789, and the Bill of Rights was added to protect civil liberties. Under the new Constitution, George Washington was unanimously elected as America's first president. He set many precedents while in office, like the establishment of the first presidential cabinet and the show of federal power during the Whiskey Rebellion. He also set the 2-term tradition by stepping down from office in 1796. This is where he issued the famous farewell address, which is one of the most important documents in American history. In it, he warned Americans to stay out of the affairs of Europe and to avoid political parties. But we also see America's first political parties in period 3. The Federalist Party, led by Alexander Hamilton, wanted an economy based on trade and manufacturing, supported the National Bank, and favored a loose interpretation of the Constitution. But Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party wanted an agrarian nation, opposed the National Bank, and supported a strict interpretation of the Constitution. Now, the American Revolution also inspired revolutions across the globe, like in France and in Haiti. And the French Revolution was a major foreign policy argument for these political parties. Period 3 ends with the presidency of John Adams, who was America's only Federalist president. His term was overshadowed by the quasi-war with France, and he lost re-election in part due to the Alien and Sedition Acts. Period 4 starts in 1800 with the election of America's first Democratic Republican, Thomas Jefferson. He believed in a strict interpretation of the Constitution, limited federal power, and an economy based on farming. And in 1803, Jefferson approved the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the United States. Foreign policy dominated much of Jefferson's presidency as he was forced to respond to the Barbary pirates and the Chesapeake leopard affair. And like Washington and Adams before him, he was plagued by ongoing conflicts between England and France, which led to the passage of the 1807 Embargo Act. And while it was meant to protect American industry and maintain neutrality, it hurt the American economy. Next is James Madison, who served 2 terms and oversaw the War of 1812. This was fought over the British impressment of American sailors and the British military presence in Western forts. This war saw the burning of the White House, the creation of the Star-Spangled Banner, and the Battle of New Orleans. And the Hartford Convention, which was led by Federalists who opposed the war, led to the party's collapse. The war ended in 1814 with the Treaty of Ghent. Elected in 1816, James Monroe served during a period of prosperity and national unity that followed the War of 1812. And his presidency is often often referred to as the era of good feelings because there was only one political party, which was the Democratic Republicans. Monroe famously issued the Monroe Doctrine, which warned European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. He was also president when Henry Clay's Missouri Compromise was passed to maintain the balance of free and slave states with the establishment of the 3630 line. But the era of good feelings ended with the corrupt bargain election of John Quincy Adams in 1824. The early 1800s saw an expansion of democracy with universal white male suffrage, enabling Democrat Andrew Jackson to become the first common man president in 1828. Jacksonian democracy and Jeffersonian democracy were similar because both supported an agrarian nation and states' rights but opposed the national bank. But Jackson's presidency was extremely controversial between his wars with the national banks and his Indian removal, which led to the Trail of Tears. Another major controversy under the Jackson administration was the nullification crisis, where South Carolina's John C. Calhoun refused to comply with the 1828 tariff, which was known as the Tariff of Abominations. Now, in response to Jackson's policies, the Whig Party was formed under the leadership of Henry Clay. The Whigs supported a strong central government and the growth of the American economy through trade and manufacturing. This was promoted by Henry Clay's American system, which supported a high protective tariff, a second national bank, and internal improvements. Now, Period 4 also focuses on the market revolution. Textile mills like the Lowell Mills grew because of the invention of the power loom and the spinning jenny. These factories also hired unskilled workers like women, immigrants, and even children. And while northern factories adopted Eli Whitney's interchangeable parts, southern plantations used his cotton gin to significantly increase cotton production. Meanwhile, western farmers used the steel plow and the mechanical reaper to tackle the tough soil. This coincided with the transportation revolution that connected the nation. New steam engines led to the creation of railroads and Robert Fulton's steamboat. And the Erie Canal and the Cumberland Road further connected regional economies. The rapid changes following industrialization also coincided with the Second Great Awakening. Leaders like Charles Grandison Finney held large camp meetings and churches saw surges in attendance. New denominations were also formed like the Mormon Church. This wave of religious enthusiasm inspired social and moral reform movements known as the antebellum reforms. Many emerged to speak out against the ills of slavery with the abolition movement, like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison. And groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union were formed to speak out against the use of alcohol. Women also gathered to fight for women's equality and suffrage, like at the Seneca Falls Convention, where they drafted the Declaration of Sentiments. This movement was spearheaded by women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, and social movements sprung up for hospital, prison, and education reform. Period 5 starts in 1844 with the election of James K. Polk. He supported Manifest Destiny, which argued that it was America's God-given duty to spread from coast to coast. Polk campaigned on an expansionist slogan, 5440 or fight, and approved the annexation of Texas. This led to boundary disputes near the Rio Grande River, which ultimately caused the Mexican-American War. The war ended in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and America gained present-day Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, and California. And shortly after, gold was discovered in California, which led to the California Gold Rush. But all of this new land led to debates over whether or not to allow slavery in these new territories. Henry Clay attempted to ease these tensions with the Compromise of 1850. This included the addition of California as a free state and popular sovereignty for Utah and New Mexico. And while it banned the slave trade in Washington, D.C., it also strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act, which angered abolitionists. These continued debates over slavery are a major focus of Period 5. Harriet Tubman famously helped enslaved people escape through the Underground Railroad, while Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin to bring awareness to the horror of enslavement. But the South responded with arguments defending slavery, like George Fitzhugh's Sociology of the South. And tensions reached a boiling point in 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed for popular sovereignty in both Kansas and the Nebraska territories. Pro- and anti-slavery groups flooded into these territories in hopes of swaying votes. Violence erupted and more than 50 people died in what became known as Bleeding Kansas. Violence was also seen on the floor of the U.S. Senate in a heated debate over slavery when Southerner Preston Brooks attacked Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner with his cane. Period 5 also saw the controversial Dred Scott decision in 1857. Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled that African Americans were not U.S. citizens and that Scott had no constitutional rights. This also overturned the Missouri Compromise. In the same year, John Brown raided Harper's Ferry in an attempt to start an armed slave uprising. Southerners viewed him as an extremist and feared the rise of violent and radical abolition, while some Northerners viewed Brown as a martyr. These debates over slavery and disagreements over protective tariffs and states' rights continued to increase tensions between the North and the South. All of this came to a head with the election of Republican Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Southern states were convinced that Lincoln would abolish slavery and began seceding from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. And when shots were fired at Fort Sumter, the Civil War officially began. While many Northerners believed that the war would be quick, it dragged on for 4 long years. The South South had superior generals and a commitment to the cause, but the North ultimately won the war because it had money, infrastructure, a higher population, and President Lincoln's leadership. During the war, Lincoln instituted a draft, suspended habeas corpus in the border states, and issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which prevented the South from gaining European support. After the war ended in 1865, America entered a period known as Reconstruction to bring the former Confederate states back into the Union. And while President Andrew Johnson and radical Republicans in Congress disagreed about the best course of action, radicals ultimately controlled this process with military reconstruction. And the Freedmen's Bureau was one of the biggest successes of Reconstruction. It provided necessities like food, shelter, and education to newly freed African Americans. And Congress also passed the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th abolished slavery, the 14th defined citizenship and guaranteed equal protection, and the 15th granted all men the right to vote. This led to the election of African Americans to Congress for the first time like Huron rebels. But Reconstruction had many failures. Although slavery had ended, it was replaced with the sharecropping system, which left African Americans working on plantations and in a cycle of debt. And Southern states disenfranchised black voters by using poll taxes and literacy tests. And the rise of black codes, Jim Crow laws, and white supremacy groups like the KKK hindered progress. Period 5 ends with the Compromise of 1877. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes was chosen as the president in return for removing troops from the South, ending Reconstruction. Period 6 spans from 1865 to 1898. The Gilded Age saw the development of corporations like U.S. Steel and Standard Oil. These businesses were run by wealthy industrial capitalists like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. New business practices like the formation of trusts and vertical and horizontal integration enabled these companies to form monopolies. This was possible because of a string of Republican presidents who supported laissez-faire policies. Workers endured long hours, low pay, and poor conditions. This led to the rise of labor unions like the American Federation of Labor, who used strikes and collective bargaining to fight for change. But strikes like the Great Railroad Strike and the Pullman Strike were unsuccessful because the government sided with businesses. Unions were also blamed for Chicago's Haymarket Square riot. But during this time, there were some attempts to control businesses like the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Interstate Commerce Commission. New philosophies also emerged during the Gilded Age. For example, social Darwinism was the economic form of Darwin's survival of the fittest, while Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth argued that it was the duty of the wealthy to donate their wealth to fund libraries, schools, and community projects. Also, the social gospel movement aimed to apply Christian principles to the problems caused by industrialization and urbanization. This period also saw the rise of immigration and urbanization. Tenement houses were built for the poor and for immigrants who often settled in ethnic neighborhoods. While the antebellum period saw immigration mostly from Germany and Ireland, these new immigrants mostly came from Southern and Eastern Europe. And political machines like Tammany Hall often took advantage of these immigrants by trading services for votes. Nativism also increased, especially against Chinese immigrants who arrived on the West Coast, which led to the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. As Americans moved west under the Homestead Act, corporations also looked west. The Transcontinental Railroad was finally completed in 1869, connecting the East and West Coasts. And railroads expanded across the West through government land grants. Mining and ranching were also set up in Western territories. But the rapid development of the West had devastating consequences for Native Americans who inhabited these lands and led to the decimation of buffalo populations. And tensions exploded in the Plains Wars, which dominated the late 1800s. Tribes like the Nez Perce and the Lakota Sioux fought to maintain their ancestral lands and their autonomy. But the U.S. Army devastated these tribes at tragic events like the Sand Creek Massacre and at Wounded Knee. Despite the efforts of indigenous peoples like the Ghost Dance movement or their victory at Little Bighorn, these tribes were ultimately defeated. And the decades of government injustices against Native Americans was exposed in Helen Hunt Jackson's book, A Century of Dishonor. Meanwhile, assimilationist schools like the infamous Carlisle School sought to erase Native culture and force conversion to Christianity. And the 1887 Dawes Severalty Act broke up tribal lands, offering citizenship to natives who agreed to assimilate. Industry also expanded in the South. Atlanta journalist Henry Grady promoted what he called a New South, a South that was focused on economic diversity. Southern cities like Birmingham and Memphis built steel mills and lumber plants, while Georgia and the Carolinas built textile factories, and Virginia established tobacco manufacturing plants. And finally, period 6 saw the rise of the populist movement. Populists were mostly farmers who struggled with low crop prices and debt. Their Omaha platform supported the unlimited coinage of silver, a graduated income tax, and the direct election of senators. Their platform was adopted by Democrats Democrat candidate William Jennings Bryan in the election of 1896, where he gave the famous Cross of Gold speech supporting bimetallism, but he lost to Republican candidate William McKinley. Period 7 covers 1890 to 1945. In 1890, Frederick Jackson Turner wrote his Frontier thesis, which argued that the frontier was officially closed. This transitioned America from manifest destiny and into the age of imperialism. And President McKinley was America's first imperialist president. He annexed Hawaii and brought America into the Spanish-American War after the sinking of the USS Maine and the publication of the Dulon Letter. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris, and the U.S. gained access to Puerto Rico, Guam, Cuba, and the Philippines, which led to the Philippine-American War. But Americans debated imperialism. Some believed that it was necessary to compete with Europe, while others argued that it was white man's burden to spread American culture. But anti-imperialists believed imperialism contradicted American values like freedom and equality. President Theodore Roosevelt was also an imperialist. His Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine stated that the U.S. had the right to intervene in Latin America to maintain peace and stability. His foreign policy was called Big Stick diplomacy, and an example was when Roosevelt supported the Panamanian independence movement to build the Panama Canal. Period 7 also includes the Progressive Movement, which was a period of social activism and political reform. Muckraking journalists inspired reform by exposing social problems and political corruption. Ida Tarbell exposed Standard Oil, and Ida Wells spoke out against lynching. And Upton Sinclair's The Jungle exposed the meatpacking industry, while Jacob Riis photographed poor living conditions in cities. Roosevelt was also the first progressive president. His Square Deal promoted consumer protection, controlling corporations, and conservation of resources. He did this by breaking up trust, creating national parks, and establishing the Food and Drug Administration. President William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson also oversaw progressive reforms, including the passage of the 16th through the 19th Amendments. And economic reform was achieved with the Clayton Antitrust Act and the creation of the Federal Reserve. But reform took a back seat when World War I broke out in Europe in 1914. While President Wilson maintained neutrality, the nation transitioned to wartime production to support the Allied cause. And after years of German unrestricted submarine warfare and the publication of the Zimmermann telegram, America joined the war in 1917. During the war, civil liberties were restricted with the Espionage and Sedition Acts, and federal power was expanded through new organizations like the War Industries Board. President Wilson created a plan to avoid future conflicts called the 14 Points, which he hoped would be added to the Treaty of Versailles. But the Senate refused to ratify the treaty, mostly because of the controversial League of Nations. Reservationists like Henry Cabot Lodge opposed the League of Nations because they feared it would interfere with American autonomy. World War I was followed by a period of prosperity and social change called the Roaring Twenties. During this time, Americans bought cars and new appliances. Women who had recently gained the right to vote also expressed themselves with their new flapper style. And the mass exodus of African Americans from the Jim Crow South to the North, which is known as the Great Migration, led to the Harlem Renaissance. This was a flourishing of Black culture through art, poetry, and jazz music, and young Americans danced to that music at clubs and speakeasies. These were secret underground clubs that served alcohol, since the 18th Amendment created a period known as Prohibition. But the rapid changes of the 1920s faced backlash. Nativism increased after the war, leading to immigration quota laws and the Red Scare, and racial tension sparked several race riots like the Tulsa Race Massacre. And religious fundamentalism opposed the teaching of evolution as seen in the Scopes monkey trial. But the Roaring Twenties ended with the stock market crash in October of 1929, which started the Great Depression. The economic crisis was caused by excessive spending on credit, buying stocks on margin, and a crisis in farming. Americans lost their savings, jobs, and homes under the poor leadership of President Herbert Hoover, who failed to take action. But in the election of 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt promised the American people relief, recovery, and reform with his New Deal. Relief for the unemployed included programs like the Works Progress Administration. He also introduced reforms like the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and Social Security. But the New Deal was criticized for being an overreach of federal power, especially by the Supreme Court. Ultimately, the Great Depression ended with the outbreak of World War II. FDR attempted to stay neutral, but approved the cash and carry and lend-lease programs to provide aid to the Allied forces. He also instituted America's first peacetime draft. But the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, forced America to join the war. This also led to discrimination against Japanese Americans and Japanese internment. Like World War I, women worked in factories making ammunition and airplanes, but could also serve in the Women's Army Corps. Other groups like the Tuskegee Airmen and the Navajo Code Talkers were instrumental in American victory as well. While the war in Europe ended with German defeat not long after D-Day, the war in the Pacific continued. Using the research and development from the Manhattan Project, President Harry Truman chose to use the atomic bomb to force the Japanese to surrender. So period 7 concludes with the end of World War II and the formation of the United Nations, both of which have significant effects on American foreign policy moving forward. Period 8 spans from 1945 to 1980. After World War II, America experienced a period of prosperity. With the passage of the GI Bill, families grew and moved into suburbs like Levittown. Conformity and consumerism were the norm, with husbands who commuted to work on Eisenhower's interstate system, while wives bought the latest consumer appliances and cared for the family. But young Americans rebelled against conformity like the Beats. This coincided with the developing Cold War, which was a period of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. At home, Americans feared communism during a second Red Scare. This hysteria was driven by the House Un-Americans Activities Committee and Senator Joseph McCarthy, as well as the convictions of Alger Hiss and the Rosenbergs. Meanwhile, Cold War foreign policy centered on containing communism, which was first proposed in George Kennan's Long Telegram. This was seen through the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, and the Eisenhower Doctrine. The Eisenhower administration also used brinkmanship to deter Soviet aggression. Later policies include Kennedy's less aggressive, flexible response, while Nixon's détente sought to ease tensions. There are a few critical Cold War events that you want to know. The first challenge was the Berlin blockade and the Berlin airlift in 1948. America responded to the Soviet blockade of Berlin by airlifting supplies to West Berliners. And the Korean War, which was fought between 1950 and 1953, is important because it was the first proxy war of the Cold War. It showed that both sides were willing to go to war over their ideals, even if it was indirect. And the Cuban Missile Crisis is the closest America and the Soviet Union were to an all-out nuclear war after Americans discovered the installation of Soviet missiles in Cuba. Kennedy and Khrushchev were able to negotiate a diplomatic solution which helped thaw tensions. The Vietnam War also occurred in Period 8. Out of fear of a domino effect in Asia, Eisenhower and Kennedy first sent military advisors, but both refused to send combat troops. This changed after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, when President Johnson sent 500,000 American troops within 4 years. The war was met with heavy opposition at home as the counterculture movement protested the draft and families saw the war from their televisions. Events like the My Lai massacre and the publishing of the Pentagon Papers also increased Americans' distrust in the government. The civil rights movement also gained momentum in the 1950s and 1960s. The movement saw early victories like the Brown v. the Board of Education case and the Montgomery bus boycott, which was started by Rosa Parks. Groups like Martin Luther King Jr.'s Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee fought for equality through marches, demonstrations, and sit-ins. And after being arrested in 1963, King wrote the famous Letters from a Birmingham Jail, where he stressed the importance of civil disobedience. And these tactics were successful, leading to the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. But some opposed the slow pace of the movement, like Malcolm X and the Black Panthers, who supported more direct confrontation and black nationalism. While Johnson oversaw new civil rights legislation, he also implemented new programs to combat poverty. Johnson's Great Society established Medicare, Medicaid, Project Head Start, and other programs for low-income families. But like the New Deal, it met resistance over increased government spending and providing welfare. The success of the civil rights movement inspired other groups to fight for change. Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, inspiring women to challenge traditional gender norms. She also helped establish the National Organization for Women and pushed for an Equal Rights Amendment. But some conservatives like Phyllis Schlafly opposed the bill and fought to maintain traditional gender roles. Latino Americans fought for equality with the Chicano movement and Cesar Chavez with the United Farm Workers Association, while Native Americans fought with organizations like the American Indian Movement. And while LGBTQ+ groups advocated for safety and equality, they saw little changes as demonstrated by the Stonewall riots. Another movement to know is the environmentalist movement, which was inspired by Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring. She exposed the use of damaging pollutants and chemicals like DDT. This inspired the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and the passage of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. It also led to the celebration of America's first Earth Day. Period 8 ends with Jimmy Carter's administration. Even though he successfully negotiated the Camp David Accords, Carter was criticized for a weak economy because of continued stagflation and for his failure to negotiate the release of American hostages in Iran. Period 9 starts in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan. Between the Iranian hostage crisis and a wave of conservatism, Republican Ronald Reagan won the presidency in the election of 1980. His campaign focused on shrinking the size of the federal government, decreasing spending, and supply-side economics, which is known as Reaganomics. But while Reagan decreased spending by cutting Great Society programs, he increased defense spending. For example, he supported the Strategic Defense Initiative, which is also known as Star Wars, in the ongoing arms race with the Soviet Union. But Reaganomics was criticized because corporations and the wealthy benefited from his tax cuts, while many argued these benefits failed to trickle down to the working class. Reagan was also criticized for his role in the Iran-Contra affair. But most of Reagan's foreign policy was focused on ending the Cold War. He and Gorbachev focused on more diplomatic solutions, including his famous speech at the Berlin Wall. Ultimately, the Cold War ended in 1991 under President George H.W. Bush with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. For the remainder of Period 9, foreign policy is focused on the growing crisis in the Middle East. For example, President Bush sent American forces into Kuwait during the Gulf War, which is also known as Operation Desert Storm. The goal was to prevent further aggression from Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi leader who had invaded Kuwait. And in 2001, President George W. Bush announced a war on terror following the September 11, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center. American forces were dispatched in Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom to combat terrorism, remove Saddam Hussein from power, and to capture Osama bin Laden. Meanwhile, domestic policy in Period 9 is dominated by increasing political polarization. Since 1980, the Democrat and Republican parties have intensely debated issues like federal spending and immigration policies, as well as social issues like abortion and gay marriage. And the parties argued over how the federal government should respond to national crises like the Great Recession and the COVID-19 pandemic. Migration and immigration are also a big part of Period 9. The Midwest, which was once known as the Steel Belt, transformed into the Rust Belt because of a decline in manufacturing and overseas competition. And international migration from Latin America and from Asia increased dramatically, which led to political debates and an increase in nativism. The new immigrants influenced American culture and supplied the economy with an important labor force. And the final topic of Period 9 is globalization. With new technologies like personal computers, the internet, cell phones, and social media, the world is more interconnected than ever. Economies are also connected through groups like the World Trade Organization and the North American Free Trade Agreement. So to bring us full circle, globalization is like the Columbian Exchange that we talked about in Period 1. It brings people, goods, and ideas closer together, and it aims to grow global economies through increased trade, new industries, and new markets. So that's a quick walkthrough of each period in APUSH. And if you need more help like study guides, timelines, and summary videos, make sure you check out the Ultimate Review Packet.